Yo, today I'm going to show you 5 React patterns I use all the time in just 5 minutes. They're really easy to pick up, not too fancy, but super useful. So let's dive into it. We're going to start with suspense, which is a built-in component that lets us wait on some asynchronous code such as a React server component or data fetching and render a fallback UI in its place. So suspense is often used in tandem with React lazy, which lets us dynamically import a component that is heavy, such as a chart or a long list, or in our case, a component that performs an expensive computation. So taking a look at how React suspense actually acts, if we click load heavy component, it's going to update the state, and then you'll see that we get the fallback UI and then finally the heavy component. So once this conditional is met, we get that initial heavy showing text, but we also have this suspense with the fallback UI. So wrapped in the suspense is this heavy component, which is lazy loaded, where we pass in a function and then return the import path for the component. And within this heavy component here, you'll see that we're just doing this very heavy computation with 10 million items. So suspense is especially useful within the context of Next.js, as you can pass in a React server component as the children instead of a lazy loaded component. You'll notice here we're fetching some data from this fake data source, and then we render it after we also add some artificial delay. So we take a look, we refresh this, we see the suspense fallback UI, and then finally the posts are loaded. We're next going to look at the slot pattern, which allows us to take a component and make it very flexible and reusable. So for instance, this card component right here, we can either hard code everything inside, or we can add these slots, as they're called, which allow us to fit in different components to different parts of the card. So the actual HTML structure of this card is very simple, but you can see that we have these 3 different props, which are React nodes that we're passing in. And then here we can slot in the header, body, and footer to the component. So on the right, you'll see that we have different headers for both of these cards, different bodies, and then different footers. Now we can take the slot pattern even further by using the Radix UI slot package. So this package right here gives us this slot component, which will take in all styles put onto it and then transfer it to its children. So essentially the children becomes just one giant slot. So you'll see as a very simple example, we have this bgred300 class and p2 class, and it gets applied directly to the button even though it's on this slot component. If we look at the rendered HTML here, you'll see that it is indeed applied directly to the button. So these custom buttons right here are slightly more complicated versions where we have this as child prop, and we either use the slot if it's as child, or we render this button and then finally render the component down here. Now we're going to look at refs, which have a couple of different use cases within React. So I would say the primary one is essentially tagging an element so we can look at it and interact with it. And it's kind of similar to how you might use a query selector in vanilla JavaScript, like getElementById. So here we have this input ref, and you'll notice that we're slapping it on this input element right here. And this lets us reference it and call some of the functions that are associated with it. For instance, we can call this select function, and as you'll see, it selects the text within it. But there are plenty of other different things we can do, like getBoundingClientRect. So you'll see we can measure the element, and then we can also toggle some classes using the ClassList.toggle here. Now, this is particularly useful when you have a component that you can actually pass a ref into, so you can expose some of the lower level functionality here, right? So this component has an input in it, and if we pass in this ref, we can actually focus it without having to do any logic within here. So as you can see, we click it and it focuses it. So refs are also commonly used to store state that you don't want to trigger a re-render. So as a very simple example, we have this isFetching boolean, which is stored in a ref, and you'll notice we can actually update it using the .current and the assignment operator, and this handle fetch function is essentially gated and it will not call again if we are currently fetching, right? But down here in the onClick handler, you'll see that we're using the isFetching.current as the disabled. But like I said, because it does not trigger a re-render, when we click fetch data, you're not actually going to see anything because this will not update, and so React doesn't know to re-render this component and essentially disable it. Finally, we're going to look at 2 different ways that we can render components within each other, and we're going to start with the functional components as props pattern. So normally when you are rendering children or a slot, you're going to be using the React node type, but in this case, we're going to be using the functional component type and passing in the exact shape of the data that the component expects. So in doing this, we're allowed to actually call it like a normal React component, as you can see here. So usually if we had children, we would have to call it within curly braces, but that is not the case here. So this is particularly useful when your wrapper component or whatever has some sort of data inside that you need to render within a specific API or pattern. So that's going to be useful in things like tables or chart renderers, and then custom lists of items, and then maybe like form builders. Now that we've looked at the functional component as props pattern as well as the slot pattern, we'll take a look at render props, which is kind of like a combination of both. So on the right here, we have this very simple mouse position display. We have these 2 components, but when we're actually rendering them, we are rendering them through a function that returns the X and Y that we can use as parameters. So the key takeaway here is that children doesn't have to be a React node. It can also be a function with these arbitrary arguments that returns a React node, and we're rendering it here. So we can pass in this function, extract the X and Y, and then use that to create the simple display and then the visual display. Just as another example, we have this data fetcher down here, which is going to get some fake data and then finally render it with this data loading an error parameter. And then we are allowed to have these conditionals. So if it's loading, we're going to have this fallback UI, as you can see for a second. And once it is done, we're going to render all of the posts. And those are the 5 React patterns that I wanted to share with you today. If you learned something, you want to see more content like this, please consider subscribing. It means so much to me. Anyways, thank you for watching, and I'll catch you in the next one. Peace.